Wow, Jenya, what an interesting discussion. Thank you so much to PV Evolutions Lab for that insight. If anyone would like to follow up with Jenya, he'll be on our networking platform, so please find him there. We now have a panel discussion on strategize your costs, cut costs, not quality. Edmee Kelsey, CEO of 3 Megawatt, will be leading this discussion with our speakers from Enel Green Power, Longroad Energy, and Arevon Energy. Once again, please do send in your questions using the live Q&A Slido function to the right. Thanks.
Thank you, Emily. And we're back for the third panel today. The panel that I'd like to introduce right now, starting with Jeremy.
Thank you, Edmee. I'm glad to be here today, folks. Jeremy Law, Head of Asset Management here at Longroad Energy. Longroad is a developer, owner, and operator of wind and solar assets across the U.S. At the end of this year, we'll be managing just about a little over 3 gigawatts of wind and solar projects. And we span a pretty wide range from kind of small rooftop. We've got a pretty sizable DG fleet that we own and operate, all the way up to a number of large utility scale wind and solar projects and soon to be storage projects. I'm head of asset management here. So on the service business side of Longroad, we provide turnkey asset management and O&M. We're kind of a full scope shop is really our focus. And we do that kind of on all of these assets. I know we're focusing on solar today. Prior to COVID, we actually had offices. Those still exist, but prior to COVID, we had offices in Boston, San Francisco, and Portland, Maine. And our remote monitoring center, operations center, is located in Portland, Maine, where I am today. And just me personally, my background, about 10 years in the renewable space, in a number of different roles, and kind of starting out boots on the ground on operating wind projects. Spent some time in finance, and then kind of made my way back to the operations side to kind of bring that finance and operations together in asset management. So happy to be here today and participate in the panel.
Thank you, Jeremy. Davide?
Yeah, thank you, Edmee. Hello, everyone. Davide Grandi. I am the manager for the solar and battery storage technical support team in O&M for Enel Green Power. Enel Green Power, we are owner and operators of large utility scale renewable project of every technology: solar, wind, hydro, and geothermal. And we own and operate about 5 gigawatt in the United States, and so much more worldwide. About 25% of that in the United States is solar. And me personally, I joined Enel Green Power about 3 years ago, and before that, I pretty much spent my whole career as a especially solar and inverter specialist. So working for solar inverter manufacturers, and so that's pretty much my background. Yeah, I'm happy to be in this panel and looking forward to it.
Great, thank you, Davide. Justin?
Hi all, my name is Justin Johnson. I'm the president and CEO of Arevon. We are a Capdyne affiliated company, Capital Dynamics. So we own and operate about 3,500 megawatts of solar. We have a smaller wind portfolio of about 500 megawatts in the US and another couple hundred megawatts in the UK. But we're most active in this solar and now battery storage space. I've been with Capital Dynamics Arevon for 3 years. And prior to that, I was with EDP Renewables for 10 years. And before that, Horizon Wind Energy. So I did a lot of stuff for them, from procurement to asset management to performance management to development construction. So I look forward to the discussion today.
Great, well, thank you for the introduction. So as you can all see, we have a lot of experience here around the virtual panel table. But one of the things that I think is very interesting is that all three of our panelists have been in wind and in solar. And so one of the questions that I'd like to kick off with, and I'd like to start to ask that question to Jeremy. I mean, Jeremy, you've been at First Wind for a long time. Now you're doing solar and wind. Where do you see the differences between solar O&M and wind O&M? Is one easier than the other?
Yeah, it's interesting, Edmee. I think coming from the wind side, I was definitely one of those wind guys who came in and said, how hard can this be, right? I would sit on, or I'd listen to panels and I would hear about vegetation and soiling, and I would say, okay, guys, well, we just had a blade crack in half or a hub break or a serial defect that cost millions of dollars. This sounds like really easy. Well, I don't know why solar should be so hard. And I would say, yeah, I think learn the hard way. I don't know if I would necessarily say one is harder or easier. I would just say the approach is very different. And to pull out a couple of kind of key differences is when we think about wind and when we think about production losses specifically, right? And it's about trying to optimize that asset. I think on the wind side, it's really at this point, generally the lion's share, you can focus on availability of the equipment. And when you're focusing on the availability of the equipment, you know, you're driven by what the data you're getting on the SCADA side, and you're driven by warranties and repairing. And there's a whole kind of slate of improving the availability of the equipment. But I would say generally, not in all cases, but generally that's where the losses are. And on the performance side, relative to power curve, I would say there are losses there and there's opportunities and we go find those, but they're not generally driving the losses. On the solar side, I would say we would say that's completely flipped, where you folks are focusing, it's easy to focus on the inverter availability relatively. And we kind of hear over and over as we step into projects that our inverter availability is fine or is not, but it's fine. They know what it is, but we keep missing our projections. And there's this generally kind of black hole of loss of folks, a lot of cases don't know where it is. So I would say, and just really focusing on the analytics side, solar forces us, I would say, to be much more, analytics driven, to find all those sources of loss that are generally sitting on the DC side and understanding them and removing the seams so that you can fix them quickly. So I would say one, not necessarily harder than the other, but maybe to close, I would say we do continue to hear from particularly new owners that why isn't solar easy? And I would say it is certainly not. And you certainly want to have a strong kind of analytics team that can find all of those losses and then go quickly fix them.
Justin, do you agree with what Jeremy just said, or do you have any other difference that you want to highlight?
Yeah, I'd just say the challenges are definitely different between wind and solar. There's, my background started almost entirely in wind with EDPR all those years. So there's a lot more going on at a wind farm and just a lot more to manage. It requires a lot more there's just more labor involved. I think some of the challenges that are most pressing for us in solar that we end up dealing with is that you have kind of obsolescence. A lot of inverter manufacturers are no longer around. So we had that in wind in the early days too, but you don't see that as much anymore. So you're always dealing with that in solar where, Advanced Energy, Eaton, Schneider, whatever, they're not around and not supporting inverters in the same way that they used to. So that can be challenging. And, just the response times in solar, if you have these smaller sites or access restrictions, can delay getting things back online, just, mobilizing a technician, getting approval to access the site, that sort of thing. On the whole, though, I do think that solar is easier than wind. I've developed, constructed, and operated both. And I think solar is just, it's easier at every stage. It's easier to develop, it's easier to construct, and it's easier to operate. So
you're only going to do solar from now on? Is that it?
We're kind of, we cater to what our investors are really interested in. And we've done more solar recently, mostly just because the commercial risk profile of the solar assets that we've invested in is less risky. We don't do hedge agreements. Like a hedge does not equal a PPA, I think, as these guys could tell you. So that's something we're not interested in. And a lot of the solar plants we bought have these long-term bus bar curtailment protected PPAs, which are our investors like. So that's what we target. So can't
Thank you.
find wind anymore.
Davide, I have a different question for you, changing tack a little bit. As a developer, owner, operator, you have influence over the entire life cycle of the asset. So one of the questions that I have for you is, what can you do very early on when you select your equipment and when you install your equipment to make sure that you're already planning for lower O&M costs? And what kind of, do you have a feedback loop in place that you're really actually looking what you've did and if it worked and then feeding it back into the development team?
Yeah, great question. I mean, the short answer is yes. And the thing here, especially when we start talking about qualities, of course, we want to maximize the quality from the get-go, right? Every component or every plant has what is called inherent availability, which pretty much is what it's embedded in its design. And you can go lower than that if you don't do, all your homework and all your proper O&M activities. But if you don't have capital improvement or so on, you're not going to go higher than that. So maximizing that inherent availability becomes critical. And how to do it from an O&M point of view, it means having a very tight feedback loop and a very tight discussions with the development team, with the procurement team, with the engineering team, right? Because all those lessons learned that we kind of learn the hard way, right? once we operate the site, they need to find their way back into the early stages of the processes.
And maybe a bit of a facetious question, but because the development team always wants to do what they think best and what makes the most money and gets the project done. So are they listening to the feedback loop?
I think the critical part is trying to evaluate all these proposals from a life cycle cost point of view, right? If we have one activity that is gonna cost $200,000, as at year zero, but that saves, $500,000 for every year of your plant operating, does this improve your life cycle cost? Of course, yes, right? Or no, or maybe there are situations where that's not the case. So finding that fine tuning and the optimization right there, I think it's critical to kind of drive the message across different organizations or different departments that might have different goals or objectives in mind.
Yeah. So Jeremy, you probably get involved a little bit later in the life cycle than Enel. So what is it that you do maybe during construction, already setting yourself up success for long-term ownership and lowering cost where possible?
Yeah, it's a good question. I would agree much of what Davide said. I mean, I think so we do get involved kind of at the same stage. So our team's developing a new project. We're working very closely with them. I would definitely echo what you said, is that it is a tough balance, because they're certainly driving to try to get the project built. And if a developer took every operating expense assumption that I ever put forward and the ops team put forward, we probably wouldn't build a lot of projects, right? We're always going to fall on the conservative side. So I think what I would say is that the long-term kind of ownership and management, if it's not ownership, at least management experience with the assets really helps, right? And we saw this in wind, that at the early days, you weren't exactly sure, and it was moving so fast, and the market was moving so fast that you had to make, somewhat lightly informed decisions about what was the right technology, who was the right company to partner with. So, I think in solar, we're seeing that similarly. So we work really hard to find a couple of key OEMs that we can partner with. The ops team and the asset management team has a lot of input there, and the feedback loop just takes time, right? So the feedback loop, it might not be until a year after COD or 2 years after COD that you've learned now that actually the service team that was sold to you is not that good. And And you can only learn that if you're still there. So I would say it's a very organic process. We're sitting side by side, and oftentimes we're negotiating the service contracts during the development phase. So that helps us take those lessons we're learning. We say, you know, this is not working very well at this project that we're working with you guys today. So we want to make the change here. But I won't pretend it's easy. The folks on this call know that it's always, particularly where costs are kind of trying to get driven to the floor right now, it's going to be a challenge. So, you know, I would say it's an ongoing effort with the dev team to try to make the right choices.
Yeah. So Justin, I've seen CD Arevon buying existing projects. So can you maybe share with the audience some tips and tricks and things that you're doing when you're onboarding the asset that sets you up for success?
Yeah, sure. That we've done a lot of that over the years, and my team is much more in the details of that than I am. But there's a lot of gotchas, you know, that we've uncovered over the years, and it's the devil's in the details and those sorts of things. But it's the little things, you know. We're buying some assets right now from LS Power, and little things can hang you up, like, you know, communications bills with AT&T or Verizon or whoever you deal with, making sure that you get access to those accounts, and a lot of those are auto paid. Making sure you change over how those are being auto paid, because if you lose comms, you know, that can take a whole plant offline or cause other issues. So we like to start, and there's all kinds of little details like that, keeping the same bank accounts in place, because you know, and giving us access to those bank accounts for a month or so, just to make sure that all the cash flows coming in and out of those accounts, you think that you have it all mapped out and have moved everything over, but it might surprise you, you know, some revenue coming in from a source you didn't really realize, or some cost that's being paid that you weren't sure about. So we typically like to engage at least, you know, 2 to 3 months prior, like early in the closing process, and start having weekly meetings with the seller, just to start going through our onboarding checklist and start asking all these questions and figuring out where things are in the data room, or if it's not there, getting it added. And then depending on the nature of how quickly the close happens or the complexity of the assets, we might actually pay to keep the existing owner or asset manager on for a brief, you know, 2 to 3 month transition period, just to make sure all the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed. As part of that transition. Yeah, I think that's probably it.
Thanks. So Jeremy, when you look into O&M, I understand you're doing some yourself and some you're outsourcing, because the title of our panel is Cutting Costs and Not Quality. When you're looking at O&M contracts, would you sleep better at night if you have planned and unplanned maintenance included, or do you take sort of auto-insure for unplanned maintenance and doing it yourself, or do you have one strategy, or does the strategy depend on what the asset is and where the asset is and who built it? Can you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's much the latter, that it very much depends on the asset. So in terms of, I mean, certainly the things that we're trying to fix, the costs we're trying to fix are the ones that, you know, the counterparty we are working with is best positioned to own the risk on. So where possible, it depends a lot on the equipment, the age of the equipment. You know, we are contracting with an O&M provider, maybe the OEM, on a newer project to wrap it all. Certainly, you know, that's the wind approach. On the solar side, we're certainly more varied. So we've got everything from assets where we own all the risk, where it's our people on site. Why might we do that? Maybe because there's just not a, you know, high quality provider in that area, and we've got enough density to have our own people. Because one of the things certainly with solar that is different from wind is there's just there is by its very nature more seams in the management of the assets than there are on the wind side. Typically, there's just more people involved with different pieces of the project that on the operations side just adds friction. So if we can, we try to remove that. If you can remove it all and have one person, one company take it because they can price the risk, in a way that's attractive to us, great. Then we'll do that. If we can't, because they're going to price that risk too high, then yeah, we'll own that risk. We'll source the parts if we need to. We've got some older projects, and we found this on the wind side as well with things like clipper equipment, that trying to get somebody to own that risk just made it economically unfeasible. So what we'll do is on a project like that, maybe what we can do is if we work with a third party, maybe we'll wrap the unplanned labor, right? They can control that, but then we'll wear the parts risk. And generally, if we're wearing the parts risk, we also like to handle the sourcing because, having that disconnect between I own the risk, but they own the sourcing just puts us in this, the incentives are in the wrong place. So I know it's a little rambling, Edmee, but I would say probably because of the range of age and size and types of our assets, I would say there is no one size that fits all that we've found. We'll very much look at that asset. What's the risk appetite of the particular owner, and then adjust, based on that.
Yeah, I think I do agree with you. I think it's very difficult to get one strategy for everything, particularly if you have a diverse portfolio. So that makes total sense to me. For the people just joined, just want to remind you, if you have any questions for our panelists, please to go to Slido to ask questions. I'd like to finish up this round just with a question still to Davide and Justin about the future. So what things are you seeing, like Davide, what things are you doing today now in O&M to help cut cost and not quality, and where do you see O&M evolving to further be more cost competitive going forward?
Sure. Well, the first thing, at least in my opinion and in our opinion, is to try to have every activity that we do, and I should say that we in-source pretty much everything that we can as far as an O&M activities on site. It's in a planned way. It's well known that planned maintenance is what, a third of the cost of a reactive maintenance, right? So the worst thing that we can do from a cost perspective is to let our equipment fail and then run to fix it, right? So the way that I see the future in this situation is, and I like to do like a little bit of a comparison to, for example, other industries like the manufacturing industries, where 30 years ago, it was pretty much in the same situation. It was pretty reactive. It was, my motor or my machine that I'm using in my manufacturing process broke up. Now take an outage and run and fix it. And now they have system in place to foresee this coming and then do it intervention at our own time in a planned way. And, and that helps improving quality, cut cost, and also improving the safety records of the facility. Now, I think that's the way even our industry should move to, right? Having figured out ways, and that's a very technical discussion, if you like, but what can we do today to kind of know beforehand, hey, my inverter, the IGBT, my inverter are about to blow up. I don't know, the MC4 connectors in my panels are about to melt, and that might happen in 3 months from now, but I know it's going to happen. That's kind of the unanswered question in this moment. The knowledge, I believe, is out there to kind of, it just needs to be put together. But that's the critical part. The more we plan, the more we do all this intervention at our own time and our own, when we want in a planned way, the more the cost is going to be cut.
Justin?
Yeah, thanks, David. Those were really good comments. It would be really awesome if we had more kind of condition monitoring capabilities for an inverter like you do on a wind turbine drivetrain or something. I think that is an opportunity that's out there. I think we focus a lot on the analytical skills and stuff and tools that we bring to monitor our plants and look for trends and do neighbor comparisons. So you can identify issues. You know, a lot of the issues that start affecting the performance of our plant that are the hardest to diagnose are those kind of ones that just creep up on you slowly. So you don't really notice it at first, and 4 months down the line, you all of a sudden see this big change in performance, and you wonder what happened. Like if you have, fuse failures maybe creeping up, string fuses in a combiner box or something. So we spend a lot of time on the analytics, and that's important because it allows you to start catching those things and be more directive with your O&M providers to go check on issues. I think that the other thing that's interesting for solar O&M that may, in the coming years, two things is use of robotics for cleaning and vegetation management. That could be, depending on where you're at in the US, either one of those things could be kind of lead to further cost reductions and improved quality in the cleaning and in the vegetation management. We already see that on cleaning solutions. Several folks have robots, and then we're just now starting to explore it for vegetation. And then the other piece is kind of like, I wouldn't call it repowering, but looking at your existing plants and just seeing what tweaks and improvements can you make to get incremental increases in production out of your plants, whether that's installing new panels or doing other things just to get a little bit more production. And with some of your legacy plants, those things can be quite valuable because they often have the richest PPAs that reward any increase in production, much more. So.
Right. Okay, I'd like to ask a question from the audience, and it kind of goes back to what we talked about earlier, the feedback loop. And the question from the audience is like, what kind of method are you using when you look at reliability, for instance, inverter reliability and the quality of the inverter and the CapEx? Like, how do you model that? I don't know who wants to take this question.
I can try. It's an interesting question, because it's a good question. I mean, the reality is that from an inverter point of view, it's there are data that can be used to model the life cycle cost. What's the historical energy availability, what's the of course, what's the initial capex cost, what's going to be the opex cost to maintain this inverter, and that kind of talks also of the maintainability of that system. There is, there are a lot of data that can be used. Another thing that I like to consider is also the reputation of the inverter, because if you talk to every inverter manufacturer, they're gonna provide data to show they are the best in the world, So how much of the data is actually applicable to your situation? So I think there are data, and then on top of that, it's the experience of the of the people that kind of use this data to do an educated guess, if you like.
Any other thoughts from the
Yeah,
panelists?
adding to that, I would say, we're constantly building new plants as well. And one of the most useful things that you have is just the performance of your inverters in your fleet, and you can develop preferences and obviously based upon how those perform. I think we look at two things really, is how they performed in the past, and then just kind of the wherewithal and commitment to the company to address issues that come up. I think, I've seen in wind and in solar now, everyone has issues that you encounter along the way, and it says a lot about a company in terms of how they deal with those issues and the effort and just how proactive they are in making things right for the customer. So that's the other factor we really look at, is we we would necessarily not buy an inverter from someone just because they've had issues. If they've been really good about dealing with those issues and communicating with us frequently and mobilizing, retrofits, whatever, we view that very positively and would consider them in the future. Whereas if you kind of give us poor service and poor responses to those issues, you can get blacklisted pretty quickly.
Great. Well, this was super insightful. I'm afraid that we've come to the end of our time of this panel. Emily, I'd like to pass it back to you.
Thanks, Edmee, and thank you to everyone on that panel. It's definitely left some food for thought. And thank you also to the audience for your questions. If you have any more questions, do use the networking to touch base with the speakers. Our next session is from Aiken, Gump, Strauss, Hauer, and Feld, a presentation on optimizing PPAs for financing. Thanks.